Welcome to The Faithful Steward. This is a podcast all about sharing biblical wisdom and practical insights in order to help church leaders pursue and teach financial freedom as part of Christian discipleship. We believe this is a spiritual conversation, and this is a place where the church needs to lead the way in order to move our communities forward in how we steward God's resources. I'm your host, James Lenhoff, and I am so passionate about this conversation and helping leaders have the confidence to step into it. We believe that if we help people thrive financially and grow spiritually, it changes everything. And I am so excited to join you on this journey. This podcast is brought to you by Good Sense. If you'd like more information about what we're up to, you can go to our website at goodsensemovement.org. All right, let's get started with today's conversation. Well, here we go. It is officially holiday season. We are off and running. I'm sure we are inundated with mailers and emails and promotions as the holiday shopping season has officially kicked off. And oh my goodness, this is an overwhelming time. It's beautiful. There's so much tradition and enjoyment and opportunity for just deep engagement with relationships, great conversations, great experiences that we get to share. There's also a whole lot of opportunity for destruction, for relationships to break down, for conversations to go sideways. There's so much that the tradition of it all can burn out in us. And there's also clearly the opportunity for destruction in our finances. And so this is a really important time for us to get our minds right, to level set, and to engage in this holiday season as faithful stewards of all of these things. Again, we will talk about finances all the time on this podcast, but being a faithful steward is bigger than that. It's about stewarding all of these resources well, and in this season, we will test all of that stewardship. And we just did a podcast where we talked about this idea of stewarding time, and never in the calendar is there a higher challenge to that stewardship than right now. As we get into the holiday season, and there's all the things that we've always done, and so we have to do them. We feel this obligation to be at every holiday party for every organization we're connected to do the same traditions, go see the same things, the lights, the shows. We've got to do all the things because we've done them before, and so we have to do them again. And that is a strain on our time. We also are engaging in relationships that might be broken. They might be contentious, particularly coming out of this election cycle. I'm sure there's still tension and contentiousness that we're dealing with across our relationships. And so when we engage in those relationships, it's really easy to have emotion and conflict roar instead of engaging in deep curiosity and asking great questions and engaging well. And so we want to just dive into how we enjoy this season, how we intentionally engage in this season to make sure that we create opportunities for flourishing and for thriving as faithful stewards, rather than creating opportunities for any of the progress that we've made to kind of fall apart at the last minute as we close out this year. And so let's start with this idea of just our time. You know, when we think about time management, and we talked a lot about this in the last podcast, we are stepping into a season where we will very easily fill our calendar. There are lots of things going on, lots of opportunities to engage, and lots of feelings that we have to do these things. And when we feel like we have to do these things, if you're anything like me, that immediately brings up this emotion of resentment. I'm so frustrated by the idea that I have to go to this thing, I have to be at that thing, I have to show up at the company Christmas party, I have to show up at the neighborhood thing, I've got to show up at these 3 or 4 family functions, I have to do all this stuff. And it's on top of I have to shop, I have to decorate the house, I have to, and all these things take time. One of the things that I have found to be the most powerful tool to break some of that resentment is to just eliminate the phrase, I have to. It's amazing how powerful words are. And when we tell ourselves, I have to do this, we have no choice but to resent or to be frustrated by, because the only reason we're doing it is because we have to. We're obligated. Someone's making us. But that's not true. We don't have to do anything. We don't have to show up at any of this stuff. We always have the choice of not doing those things. It's possible that the consequence of not doing that thing is too painful, is something we don't want, right? If I don't show up at this thing, then this relationship will be broken. If I don't show up at the company Christmas party, maybe, they'll talk about why I wasn't there, and I know the consequence will be negative. Maybe that's something I'm fine with. We have to weigh these things and decide whether or not the consequence of choosing not to do it is worth it. But if we frame it that way, then we can start to tell ourselves, I'm choosing to do this. I don't have to, but I'm choosing to because I actually want to. I want this to happen because I don't want the consequence if I don't. And I know that seems maybe like it's semantics, and it probably is, but it's really powerful. When we can shift away in our brain from the thought I have to the thought I choose to, or even maybe a stretch, I get to, everything starts to open up. We get less resentful and we feel powerful. I've chosen this. This is what I want, rather than I don't want to do this, but I have to. What that does is it starts to help us to prioritize things. If we have really weighed the consequence, I try to start with, what's the consequence if I don't? And some of those things I actually choose not to. That consequence isn't that bad, actually. I'm fine with it. I'll disappoint this person that I only talk to once a year. All right. I mean, that's probably worth it, because now I can choose to be present with my wife and my kids. Now I can choose to be present with my parents. Now I can be engaged in these things if I choose not to do this thing that really is only going to make this one person disappointed that I don't care as much about as I do these other people. We need to frame these things so that we can prioritize our time. We choose the things we want to choose, not out of obligation, but out of our own authority to make those decisions for how we're going to use God's time. And that hopefully opens us up to service and engagement in others. This hopefully is a time where it's not just about parties and celebrations. Hopefully it's also a time where we can choose to invest intentionally in others who are less fortunate and others who are in pain, who are struggling. This is a great season to build that muscle, because there's so many opportunities to do that. There's just as many chances to give ourselves away as there are to indulge in our own self-gratification, our own selfishness, our own comfort and pleasure, right? And if we weigh those choices more effectively, we can hold space for both rather than being overwhelmed by these obligations to do all these things. And so start from a place of managing your time, organizing this calendar around the things that you've chosen to do rather than the things that you have to do, and make space for the things you really choose you want to do. If that means that this tradition of going to this show or seeing this particular light display or doing this thing that's an hour away that we've done every year, we don't have to do it this year. Is it worth it? Or are there other things that are more valuable, that are higher priority, that you want to choose instead? We get to do that. Next, let's talk about relationships. How do we steward relationships well in this season? This is a season where relationships can certainly go sideways. They can feel like they've been ignored, or we can engage with other people who tend to charge us up, tend to frustrate us. We only see them a few times a year, and they always bring up the same topics, and they always push the same buttons. What I encourage us to consider in this season is how do we show up with more curiosity? How do we engage in the humanness of the other person by asking great questions, by being uniquely and over the top interested in them, really wanting to understand, really wanting to hear what's going on with them. This is such a great season for us to be able to serve others by being curious about them, being invested in them, and engaging in them. Around the dinner tables, all the different parties we're going to be going to, all the events that we're connected to, we can find spaces to really lean in and be curious and ask great questions. This is also an opportunity to engage in shared experiences. And so where are there relationships that might need a little bit of repair, that might need some time invested in them? What can you do together? I want to encourage us to think about what are those traditions we're choosing, and who could we invite to join us? How do we actually bring people in to share that experience with us? This is such an overwhelming season if we just are kind of along for the ride and we're just letting it happen to us. We really want to step into this with intentionality and live this time with some thoughtfulness, some awareness of how this is going to go in the next month or two, rather than just finding out afterwards that we've burned ourselves out, we've broken relationships, we had the same conversations we have every time, we did the same traditions we do every time, even though we didn't enjoy them. Those are the kinds of things we need to break by just having some simple intentionality before that comes along to think it through and choose a different path. So let's talk about finances, because this is a season that wrecks finances maybe more than any other season. This is always a challenge to balance all the priorities, all the demands, all the wants and have-to-haves that we're getting from our kids, all the sense of obligation to buy the perfect gift for every family member that we have, to make sure that we're impressing someone or that we're wowing them. And that generally comes by spending more than we planned on. More often than not, the way that we wow somebody is if we spend more than they expected that we would. And so there's always this pressure to go beyond any boundary we might set for ourselves. And we've got to be intentional around how we honor those boundaries. And that means that before the rush, before this holiday shopping season gets its hooks in all of us, before we get completely inundated with all the products and all the newest versions of everything that all comes out right now in order to attract our attention, we need to have designed ahead of time how we're going to spend, what we're going to spend, and who we're going to spend for. Make a list of who you will buy for, not because you have to, but because you're choosing to, and decide ahead of time how much you're going to spend on that person. And here's the thing, spend that money. Don't spend less. If you've decided this is what we can afford, then spend it on them. Spend it on them with joy, with confidence, with a sense of peace around it, because you've already decided this will work. What causes the anxiousness is if you don't know what you should spend, what you can afford to spend, or if you don't even really have a game plan for how many people and who you're going to spend on. You just go willy-nilly and you hope for the best. The way that this ends up working, and you've probably walked this path, is in January, everybody has this hangover. They've overspent, they've overburdened themselves, they've got credit card debt now that they didn't have before. They've added to the pile of the weight that they're carrying. And for what? So that on one day, somebody got to open a present that blew them away kind of for 5 minutes, and then the next present blew them away even more, and now you feel inadequate. This is the story that we live over and over and over again, and yet we keep doing it. It's amazing to me how marketing companies have perfected the art of either guilting us into a sense of obligation to buy for everybody, or promising us that we're going to wow the person if we buy them this thing that's out of our price range. But there is so much messaging that takes advantage of all the things that are already in us and just activates it. And what we need to do is decide ahead of time what this is going to look like. Who are the people on the list? And if, when you build that list, it turns out that in order for this to be affordable for you, that means some of these people on the list don't get something, that's just reality. That's okay. I would encourage you to have that conversation before you get to the holiday thing, before you get to the Christmas party, or you get to the white elephant gift, or you get to the whatever. Let them know, hey, just so you know, I'm not going to be able to participate this year. Or just so you know, I'm not planning on buying you something, and you don't need to buy me anything either, right? Give them some of that heads up before they get spun up and they're doing all the things. Those spirals, that anxiety just feeds on itself, and we feel like the list is never ending because we didn't make the list to begin with. We need to decide ahead of time, who are we buying for? What are we spending? And when we go to intentionally execute on that list, we're doing it with a plan. There is so little planning that happens. So prioritize based on importance, prioritize based on relationship. Dollar values need to fit into your spending plan. And if you have overspent for the year up until now, the consequence is you need to underspend now. You don't get to have everything. We can't overspend all year and then overspend at the end of the year. Something's got to give. And so face those realities and recognize what it means. And if it means there are people on your list that aren't going to get a gift, that's just the deal. Let them know, give them a heads up, and just own up to it. It's so much easier to do that than it is to go and saddle yourself with giant credit card debt just because you're afraid to have that conversation. We need to have those conversations before we get spun up in the holiday season and end up way overextending ourselves and find ourselves in January digging out of a hole that we should have never dug in the first place. One of the other things I want to inject into this thought pattern is, what does it look like for you to step into generosity as we close out the year, as we're in the holiday season? Are there opportunities for you to say no to consumption, to purchasing, to buying more stuff, and say yes instead to supporting things you care about, to giving generously to those in need, to being about the healing of brokenness and pain that is happening, rather than about self-indulgence and just buying more stuff? I am not anti-gift giving, but I am just wanting to call our attention to this idea that if we don't put generosity in the conversation with some level of intentionality, it will always take a back seat in this season to consumption and self-indulgence, because that's what this whole season has turned into. And so face this time with some understanding of where you are, what is really available, and then give some thought to, how do I carve out some of this for generosity, charitable intent, giving some of this money to people who are in need rather than just buying more presents for people who, quite frankly, probably could afford to buy that on their own, probably don't need to get something from me. How do we get to a place where we just start to change the narrative from I have to do this because I've always done it, to I'm choosing these, and because I've put boundaries in place and I've chosen intentionally ahead of time, now I've created opportunity for generosity to be part of my experience as we close out the year. We want this to be a season where we engage in the work that God is doing, where we are outward focused. This is a great season to engage your family in that kind of awareness of the pain that's happening around you, so that there's perspective, so that there's an awareness of just how fortunate you are by caring for people who are less fortunate. We want to be others-centered. We want to be focused on what God is doing, not focused on whatever the next tech gadget is. We want to be engaged in gratitude, thanking God for the provision that He's given us, for the for the beauty of the life that we get to experience. We want to engage in contentment, that what we have is good, it's beautiful, it's satisfying. The more that we engage in those things, the less we fall prey to this tendency towards overconsumption, and the more that we can actually free ourselves up to be better stewards of our time, of our relationships, of our service and our skills for others, and also better stewards of our finances, so that we're not chasing and striving and overextending in any of those areas. We're actually settled and peaceful and confident and recognizing just how incredible the human experience is when we put some of these boundaries in place and honor God with all that He has given us to manage. Well, thank you so much for listening to the Faithful Steward podcast. Be sure to check out the show notes for links and other information that we mentioned in today's episode. Also, be sure to check out our website at goodsensemovement.org to get all the resources we offer churches to help equip them in teaching financial stewardship to their community. If you have any questions or any topics you want to make sure we cover on our show, you can email me at jameslenhoff@goodsensemovement.org. I'd love to hear from you.